Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're really pleased to have Matt Cominsky from the American Forest Resource Council. He's the Washington State Director for that nonprofit. And so he's going to be talking to us this morning about legislation that's on the books from two perspectives. One is from a perspective of the funds that are generated from DNR, Department of Natural Resources, that fund our junior taxing districts and the county and schools also. They're different funds, and he's very much an expert in that space and can share some information with you. And then also the harvest levels, habitat conservation plans, and the different harvest levels and how that would affect our forestry industry in our county. But first, Matt, before you get going into some of the issues that are being debated and are being dealt with at the Board of Natural Resources and at other areas, can you kind of explain to this group? I mean, I know we've got a lot of lay people, which I would put myself into that category as well. How you know, if you could characterize the amount of forest lands that we have in our county, and maybe if anybody else wants to help out if I'm asking too specific questions, because he does cover the entire state, that would be really helpful. But if you can kind of characterize that for us and what the debate is all about, and so that, you know, there's obviously a sustainability question involved here. So we'd really appreciate kind of a quick overview and then into what the current issues are today. So, and also AFRC, what your mission is, so that we're very clear about that as well. We will be having Commissioner Hillary Franz on. They end of last week, they let me know that they needed to cancel, and so they are bumping her to June 9th. But I think this is a good prep so that we understand what the issues are and how possibly, you know, we can help. And this forum is about economic development and businesses and prosperity for all those that are having trouble making ends meet. So with that, thank you very much, Matt, and take it away.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Yes, I'm no stranger to, I guess, pinch hitting for Commissioner Franz. I had to do this when she unfortunately had a last minute need to cancel our annual meeting a couple years ago, presentation, so jumped into it. But so good morning, everyone. Yeah, as Colleen mentioned, I'm the Washington manager for American Forest Resource Council. I'm also the president-elect of a group called Advocates for School Trust Lands. We're a small nonprofit, all volunteers that work to advocate for the management of school trust lands throughout the western part of the United States, and a whole host of other titles, but the AFRC one is my full-time day job right now. And so I thought I would start with a little bit of a background. I know, seeing some of the names on the call here, you know very well who AFRC is and what we do, but for those that don't, I'll kind of touch on it. Our primary members are sawmills and those who particularly are interested in sourcing logs and other wood product raw materials for their manufacturing processes from public lands, and so Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and in Washington State Department of Natural Resources. We work in 5 western states: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Northern California. I think hopefully that was the 5. I rattle them off sometimes in different orders and I get lost as to whether or not I name them all. And like I said, primarily we focus Forest Service and BLM in 4 of those 5 states. And then in Washington, we add in the State Department of Natural Resources, which I would argue is probably the premier public state-run timber program in the country. We work from all levels, from field staff all the way up through local, state, and nationally elected officials. And we've got a pretty lean team. I should back up real quick. While sawmills are our primary members, we have a whole host of affiliated or associate members. We have in Washington about 5 or 6 counties that are AFRC members. The Port of Port Angeles is an AFRC member. Interestingly enough, in Montana, the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation is an AFRC member, primarily because of our joint interest in making sure that forest health issues on federal lands in Montana get dealt with, as well as just the economic development aspects of maintaining their forest products industry in Montana. So we run with a pretty, I would consider, lean staff. There's myself here in Washington. I'm aided in the legislative arena by our government relations director, Heath Heikkila. And then we also contract with Bruce. He is part of our legislative team here in Washington. I like to call it Team Washington. There's 3 of us, and we get a lot of things done and accomplished here. Our headquarters is based out of Portland. President is Travis Joseph. Several of you have probably met him. And he's kind of working out of our Portland, Eugene office right now. And then we have a federal forest manager, Andy Geisler, who I actually used to work with the Department of Natural Resources. And then we have 2 on-staff attorneys. That's one of the things that makes AFRC, I think, unique in the Wood Products Association realm, is actually having on-staff attorneys. Our legal program, I would say, is 99% defending agency actions, primarily Forest Service timber sales, though we do use some offensive litigation to try to shape and craft policy. And then recently here, about a year or so ago, we brought on Nick Smith. Several of you probably have heard and get his daily news clippings. He's the executive director of Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities, and is also now AFRC's communications director. And Nick's been a huge help having that internally. So that's kind of AFRC. As Colleen mentioned, I cover the entire state. The world of COVID's been a little weird in that I don't travel as much as I used to, which I kind of miss. But hopefully here things will start shifting a little bit. When it comes to Department of Natural Resources, I would say AFRC's had a long history of engagement with the beneficiaries. That's including both the federally granted trust lands, which are the lands that at statehood were granted to the state of Washington to support public education and other state entities, like the Capitol Building Fund, money that went to help build and helps maintain the state capitol, prisons, University of Washington, WSU. And then we also work closely with a lot of the county beneficiaries. Those are about 18 counties that through tax foreclosures in the 20s and 30s received a large amount of acreage that they were burdened with trying to figure out how to manage during that time frame, and ended up being deeded to the state in trust for perpetual management of beneficiaries at the county and junior taxing district level. So Clallam County has, I'm gonna use the round numbers, is about 93,000 acres. Rod and I, this has been one of our ongoing challenges over the last, I would say, 6 to 7 years is sometimes, unfortunately, it's been a moving target. And we actually have a number, it's not coming to the top of my mind right now, that a few years ago, while Kyle Blum was the assistant to the Commissioner of Public Lands, Kyle and Rod and I sat down, went through all the documents, and finally came up with a number that we could all agree to that was not supposed to shift. And it's about 92,000 and a few. I tend to round it to 93,000 for these types of conversations. So a pretty significant amount of land. I would say Clallam County, if I recall correctly, is the largest holder of county trust lands. Skagit County, I believe, is second. And then I'd have to look, but it's Lewis. There's another group of 2 or 3 that are all pretty close. I think Lewis comes in third. So those, of course, those lands are very valuable, very important, not only for the trust beneficiaries, generating revenue, but also, providing logs into the purchasing market, which then turns around to create jobs, of which, most notably, I think right now, the 2 that are, most active, Interfor in Port Angeles and Port Angeles Hardwoods, though a lot of logs also flow out of Clallam County to Mason County and to Grays Harbor County for manufacturing. Like I said, we've had a long history. We worked with the Beneficiary Coalition back in 2004 to defend the sustainable harvest calculation against litigation back then. Rod served the longest time on the settlement partners meetings that we had to go to every year. I got to spend about 6 of those, attending those with Rod. Those are behind us with the adoption of the current sustainable harvest calculation, which I will kind of go into here quickly. But so I work with a lot of different folks at, school level, state school directors, Cindy Kelly, she and I serve on a committee trying to address encumbered lands issues in Southwest Washington, not to mention, our joint work through, where WASDA and AFRC collaborate on various policy issues to try to benefit the beneficiaries and their customers. So right now, as I mentioned, there's some litigation going on. There's technically, and Rod, feel free to jump in if I get any of this wrong. Technically, right now, there's 3 lawsuits. Actually, no, excuse me, there's 4 lawsuits. Skagit County and a coalition of their junior taxing districts has sued DNR in Skagit County Court over the sustainable harvest calculation. A coalition of beneficiaries and AFRC has sued the Board of Natural Resources over the sustainable harvest calculation marble murrelet strategy. We also have a second case in which AFRC, the city of Forks, and I should have looked up the document. There's one other entity, because of legal structure, we had to have 2 different cases in order to bring the issues around sustainable harvest and marble murrelet forward. So that case and our beneficiary coalition case are basically kind of, you could think of it as one, but they're really 2 separate cases. And then there is the Conservation Northwest and several other environmental groups who are suing Commissioner Franz over the previous sustainable harvest calculation and marble murrelet strategy. That case, the Conservation Northwest one, has recently been taken up by the Washington State Supreme Court, and we just filed our briefs on that case on Monday. We're expecting a hearing sometime late calendar year of this calendar year. And the primary argument being made in that is that when you read the state constitution, they use the term all the people, and there's a legal debate over whether the defined beneficiaries of the trust are the common school and other named entities in the Enabling Act, and in the state constitution, or if it's all the people. Our lawyers feel very strongly the case law precedent, the Enabling Act, they are defined beneficiaries, but that is kind of, that's the primary case that's in front of us right now. There's also then, like I mentioned, the Skagit County case, which has also been, the Skagit County case has also been connected to the beneficiary coalition case in Skagit County. And we have a hearing on that on Friday, in which the state of Washington is asking for a stay in that case until after the Supreme Court rule. So that one, we're kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern for a couple of days until we find out how that comes out. And Rod, I see you turned your camera on, so I'm wondering if you have something you want to add.
I will say two things, Matt. One, I think it's Concrete is one of the other beneficiaries. I don't have the documents here at home, but that's what's in my mind sitting on top of my desk. And the other thing is the Supreme Court taking the case directly is unusual. I won't say unheard of or unprecedented. It's unusual. And it's on this very specific trust law question as to who the beneficiaries are. Peter Goldman and his law firm has argued, and they actually bought a law review article, I would argue, in Seattle University's law review about 20 some years ago, that makes the same argument that they're making in court. It goes against the, I'd say, a century-old, more than a century-old expectation with regard to the federal trust granted lands through the Enabling Act, but we'll see how that all plays out.
I just want to add quickly, if I may, that when we have Commissioner Franz on next month, I have committed, and I think it's appropriate that we don't address any ongoing lawsuits in this forum. I think that would complicate matters quite a bit, and that certainly is not our intent. But we will, she has wanted to talk about what the former commissioners have proposed for DNR lands, and talk about what her position is on that. So if you can also quickly, one of you guys address that, that would be really helpful, I think, for the group to understand what those questions and what the issues are.
Yeah, so so I think real quickly, you know, the beneficiary AFRC lawsuits are about getting the sustainable harvest calculation right. For any of you that tracked or participated in Clallam County's Trust Land Advisory Committee, you're well aware there was a lot of debate and question around the quality and accuracy of DNR's inventory and some of their modeling processes. And that's really what we're trying to do, is shape and make sure that that process is as robust, transparent, and accurate as possible, because, you know, we have businesses, both direct and indirect employers, whose, you know, success relies on the accuracy and transparency of the sustainable harvest calculations. So that's really what that effort's about. I would say that the other side legal case is more about structurally changing the management of these lands, the reduction or elimination of volume and active forest management from trust lands, and basically redefining the department and its mission and what it means to be a trust beneficiary, and how that revenue would basically in many cases cease. And so what Colleen was referencing is former Commissioner Goldmark and former Commissioner Public Lands Jennifer Belcher have been advocating to stop all management of trust lands in Western Washington by taking 5% of the acreage per year over 20 years out of management, and putting them basically into ecological reserves to stop climate change. And that argument has found, I would say, limited interest. Truth be told, the state can't afford to do it. If they truly paid the beneficiaries full market value, we're talking billions of dollars. And I think that there's also a lot of science coming out that really shows that if we're really serious about addressing atmospheric carbon, active forest management and manufacturing wood products is much more beneficial than walking away from it. And I think Eastern Washington is a good example of what happens when you do essentially walk away from it, and what we do and create lots of carbon going up in smoke. So that's kind of what that issue is about. Like I said, it's has a few folks still trying to push it, but in general, it kind of landed with a thud. There was an article by Linda Mapes in the Seattle Times several weeks ago. That's not really gotten a lot of traction, and there's a lot of, in my opinion, flaws in their arguments. And I will say that, from my opinion, I'm a little trying to figure out the change of position of Commissioner Goldmark, because when he was in office, he was a strong advocate for active forest management to address climate issues, to address forest health, to address wildfires, and was a very strong advocate of the trust mandate and the department's fiduciary obligation. So not really sure exactly what's going on there, but there'll be more to come, and that really plays into this whole debate the board is hearing about with old forests, which is really centering around a group of stands that were released under the Marble Murrelet long-term conservation strategy as part of kind of a trade-off between DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And several of those are connected to a failed attempt connected to the solutions table to voluntarily take additional acres off base from the long-term conservation strategy, which would have actually further harmed the beneficiaries in Clallam County as far as further reductions in volume and active and available acres for management. So happy to discuss more of that offline. We could spend another half an hour on that, but I really want to kind of get to the legislative issues and the trust land performance, because that's really, it's going to kind of affect. I see Rod's got his hand up.
So Matt, I was just going to ask you, you explained one of the proposals that came up in the last 6 weeks. There was a second proposal, and they seem to run in tandem, about what I call big, middle-aged, tall trees. So what does that, can you explain that, and also explain kind of the environmental caucuses, which isn't a universal position, but what we've heard at the board meeting yesterday and the day before, and the month before, to give folks an idea of the sentiment behind some of these ideas?
Yeah, I think, Rod, you make a really good point. The environmental community, those who kind of sit on the, I would characterize somewhat the other side of the aisle from active forest management, is very much a very broad spectrum. And what we're seeing and hearing at board meetings and outside of board meetings is basically one extreme of that spectrum, which is do nothing, never cut another tree in the entire state of Washington, which I think is a little problematic, because that has little issues with like housing and development, those type of things. To kind of the other end of the spectrum is, we're not against active forest management, we just maybe don't like the way DNR does it. And so there's kind of that spectrum, but I think what Rod's getting to is we're seeing this constant shift of the goalposts and the message. DNR has very defined policies and regulations around management of old forests and of old growth. They're in the policy for sustainable forests, they're in the HCP. If you look at the board presentation, the chair report from yesterday, there's a whole list of the history of where that's connected. Initially, this argument was about those trees that are not defined as old growth under board policies and regulations in the HCP, but are large old trees. You know, we're talking 100 and something that's between 1850 and about 1875 birth year. What we're seeing now is we're hearing arguments about trees as young as 60, and whether or not necessarily that they're old trees, but just that they're really, really tall trees. And that starts to become really problematic because what I'm seeing, because I know a lot of the landscape where some of these issues are being brought forward, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of silviculture and forestry. For example, one sale that was getting a lot of pushback was about large, they were considering them old spruce trees. Well, I happen to know that landscape very well. I've counted rings and stumps. You can have a 42-inch DBH spruce tree at about 45 years old. They grow like weeds. So there's this constant moving, and what we've seen at some of the last board meetings is even some, I would argue, disagreement within the environmental community, or trying to some organizations distance themselves from the more radical kind of anti-forestry message. So it's really creating a difficult working environment for DNR staff. I think, you know, that's something to be really aware of is, you know, DNR's field staff are hardworking professional folks trying to do their best to make sure that they check all the boxes, they do everything right. And when when the debate is constantly shifting the sides of the boxes that they're forced to work in within policy and regulation, it gets to be really challenging to do their job. So I'm confident they'll continue to move forward and do that work, but that does create a certain level of uncertainty, which that you will hear that word if you watch board meetings more and more, is the HCP was intended to provide certainty, because once again, if we're talking economic development, most people I know like to reduce risk if they're taking on new capital or looking at doing capital investments. They want to try to reduce that risk more, and certainty of where and how much you can harvest is part of reducing that risk in the forest products industry, which was the intent of the HCP. And I think where we're really starting to get concerned is questioning how much certainty there is in the HCP if we're constantly fighting these battles of those who don't like what's in the publications and the documentation that have been around for decades, and hashed out. You know, old growth was hashed out back in the late 80s, early 90s, and then has kind of become the new battleground after this Miralette strategy was put forward. And so I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge and shift. Trying to just figure out exactly where the decision space is. But yes, thank you, Colleen. Yeah, and if anybody, if I rattle off acronyms, you know, virtually slap me through the computer. Sometimes I tend to do that. But let's jump real quick into the legislative this last session, and Bruce is going to jump in if I miss anything. It was kind of I would say a crazy legislative session done virtually. It probably actually worked out better than what a lot of people thought it was going to, but it was still a challenging and difficult session to get through for all of us that work in Olympia, because one of the key things is that, you know, a lot of work gets done in the hallways just because of the hustle and bustle of the session and the way things work out. And when nobody's on campus, it's hard to make a lot of those connections, you know, just connecting with other allies, you know, in the outside of the legislative arena and those inside. So AFRC went into the session with basically the goal of protecting the DNR trust mandate and the timber sale program, trying to make sure that we didn't have any legislative issues that reduce the efficiency or the outputs of DNR. And that was kind of what our real initial focus was, along with trying to get the Forest Health and Wildfire bill through and passed. Commissioner Franz had come to AFRC and WFPA early in last fall after the Labor Day fires, looking for help in trying to move a pretty, what I would consider landmark forest health and wildfire prevention bill. So we went to work on that. Bruce and Heath and I think, had a lot of late nights and rewriting bill language and writing new bill language. But I think in the end, we were pretty successful. I'll kind of touch on one key highlight that has a connection to the North Olympic Peninsula here at the end. But environmental justice, cap and trade, I think those were the two big ones that surprisingly had a real strong nexus to DNR trust lands. There were some provisions in both of those that we worked very hard in the legislature and partnering with the State School Director Association and the Association of Counties, and basically trying to make sure that the fiduciary and constitutional obligations of the department to the beneficiaries were protected, and we didn't have increased cost burdens or negative efficiency issues added onto the beneficiaries through those bills. So I think the positive outcome of that is we were able to basically protect the trust program, the timber sale program, the ag, commercial, all of it through in both of those bills. And we probably have, I don't know, Bruce, at least a dozen, if not 30 or 40 legislators who know a lot more about trust lands and the DNR trust management program than they ever knew when they started it back in January into the legislature. So that was positive. Budget provisos. There's one that came out, trust land transfer. That's where the legislature provides funding to buy lands out of trust status. That has been a challenging issue for both the state school directors and AFRC over the last few years, because we've seen a reduction in the corpus of the trust or the total asset body. And we've been advocating to work with DNR on revamping that program going forward. And so there's a budget proviso directing DNR and giving them some money to create a stakeholder group to look at revamping trust land transfer. Management fees were reauthorized at the elevated level. So for those of you that don't track this or dig into this, by statute, DNR is allowed to keep 25 cents of every dollar they generate for pay for the management of both the federal and county trust lands. But over the last several years, last several biennium, DNR has been unable to operate at those funding levels. And so through budget proviso, they get authorization to set that upper level for the federal trust. Right now it's set at 32, and the county trust it's set at 27 by the legislature. And then the Board of Natural Resources has purview to adjust that management fee anywhere between 0 and what the legislative upper limit is. So for the next 2 years, basically DNR is running at 25 and 31, but they could go to 27 and 32 for a management fee. And then I think the other notable budget proviso really started with an effort from Colleen and some others in Clallam County, which was to try to address the need for more cedar salvage and then really alder and hardwood on the market.
And Matt?
Yes.
Real quick, that started on one of these calls that we had Senator Vandeweghe on, and he spoke about it. And then Daryl from PA Hardwoods and Sig Tama from Northwest Forest Products stayed on the call, and they talked to him after he gave his presentation. And that's where that, I know there was discussion about it in years prior, but that's what he said, okay, I'm gonna do something about it. So that was, yeah, I feel pretty cool that it's, you know, we made something happen off of one of these things. It wasn't just all chit chat.
Yeah, no, it was really good. You know, out of that basically came direction from Senator Vandaway to DNR staff of, you know, work with the stakeholders to get a program put together. Of course, because the two primary hardwood manufacturing companies are AFRC members, I ended up involved, worked with DNR. We got a 2-year pilot project put together. And the important thing is we got funding to do this out of the budget that's outside of the management fund, so that the goal is to show that we can bring additional volume to the marketplace, and at least in a break-even fashion for the trust beneficiaries. We went into this very, very conscious of the fact that this could not negatively impact the beneficiaries. And we also felt strongly that DNR could put this together in a way that at a minimum covered their costs and brought additional product to the market. So that was kind of an up and down. It ended up in a bill, ended up out of a bill, mostly for legislative efficiency reasons. Good thing it did, because the bill died. The bill was to extend lease term, or no, excuse me, not that bill. That bill was to allow DNR to advertise some of their sales in a different mechanism. That bill died before the end of the session. In the budget proviso, we do have about $325,000, $350 for the biennium to fund this pilot project in Olympic region and Pacific Cascade region, to work on bringing more cedar salvage and alder hardwood to the marketplace. So thank you, Colleen. I'm glad that one of these calls kind of kicked that off. That's been something we've been trying to do for, like you said, several years. But you know, the timing in your call, all of the stars aligned, and we got it done. And I think the purchasing community, I know AFRC, we're pretty happy with where we ended up. I think DNR is pretty happy with where they ended up with it. So now it's just, we gotta get it done and make it successful. And so I saw Mona log on earlier. So Mona, if there's anything I can do to help your region keep this moving forward, don't hesitate to ask. And then real quickly touch on the forest. Oh, go ahead, Colleen.
Oh, I know Bruce had some points he wanted to add, as he's been really involved in this space and is next to you, or Mona, or Rod, I suppose, some of the experts of our county in this space. So Bruce or Mona, do you guys want to add anything about the legislative session this year?
Well, I'll add one thing, or a couple of things, Colleen. This is Bruce Beckett. When Commissioner Franz is on your call next month, I'm going to speculate that she's going to be talking a lot about the landmark forest health bill that passed. DNR did a truly exemplary job in putting together this package that ended up passing unanimously out of both chambers of the legislature, and came along with $130 million in funding. So that's pretty unprecedented, quite honestly. And AFRC entered that process last fall with the commissioner at her request. And we had really 4 goals that were accomplished in that bill. One was to keep suppression costs in the emergency funding element of the state budget, to not be getting into the situation of fire borrowing that we saw at the federal level. Secondly, to get a dedicated, if you will, part of that funding dedicated for forest health treatments. It ended up being at 25%. We were hoping for 30%, but we're very happy with this. A priority for treatments that'll pay their way, so they have merchantable volume, those sorts of things. To really expand the role of the state in terms of its bully pulpit role with the federal government to support aggressive activities on the national forest, for the state to take that role. And that's really well drafted in the bill. And then that everything is additive to the Forest Service's efforts. In other words, to help support additional good neighbor authority and those types of treatment. And we're really pleased that all four of those goals were accomplished, in addition to what Matt mentioned, the review of the sustainable harvest calculation. So you'll probably hear a lot about that from the commissioner. She should be proud of the work that her team put together, and we're pretty pleased with the outcomes as well. Matt, you have anything to add to that, or Mona?
I'll jump in since actually I'm looking here, maybe Mona had to drop off. But no, Bruce is right. I think, good neighbor authority is one angle that has a nexus to the timber supply on the North Olympic Peninsula. DNR and their Good Neighbor program will be engaging with the Olympic National Forest again to bring some projects forward, both commercial and non-commercial, on that forest. The program is working, actually putting together targets for both commercial and non-commercial work, and we'll have plenty of funding to get that done going forward. And then I think the sustainable harvest oversight is a key part. Senator Vandeweghe was very much wanting to make sure that there was something in the forest health bill around sustainable harvest and some further engagement and oversight. I think there were some folks who weren't quite sure of the nexus until we started reminding them that Eastern Washington has a sustainable harvest calculation. And if you're going to be talking about forest health management, you need to talk about sustainability. And oh, by the way, yes, Western Washington is at risk of wildfire. I think we all remember the fire at Lake Crescent last year and others. And so as we start to talk about forest health in Western Washington, we also need to talk about the sustainability part of it. So I suspect that when Commissioner Franz comes, you probably will also hear a lot of discussion about the funding and the ability within the forest health bill to work on getting a lot of the inventory and modeling and that kind of stuff tuned up for sustainable harvest for both Eastern and Western Washington. So I think that was a huge win and something we had not expected going into the session, but we're very pleased to see that it got done by the end of the session. And
One of the things
go ahead, Bruce.
One of the things I think the North Olympic Peninsula can be, I think, satisfied with is that in the last 2 years, last year we ran a forest carbon bill, which really saved our bacon in terms of all the carbon debates this year. But between that and the forest health and environmental justice debates, we had an opportunity these last 2 years to really educate a broad range of people in the legislature on both sides of the aisle. And we had huge help on these issues from Representative Joe Fitzgibbons, who chairs the House Environment Committee, Senator Mark Elias, the floor leader in the Senate, and it really created this incredible opportunity to educate people about the importance of trust lands. And the 49-0 and 98-0 votes in the House and the Senate with the various packages in it is reflective of, I feel like we're making progress. Let's put it that way.
And then just real quickly, I'll wrap it up so we leave a little time for any other questions. Trust land performance. I'd encourage anyone who's interested in the efforts of DNR to modernize, update, improve the performance of the trust lands. Check out dnr.wa.gov/TLPA. That is a process that Senator Braun, state school directors, AFRC, DNR worked to get funding. Deloitte Analytics, who did the 1996 trust land assessment evaluation, was rehired to do that. I would really encourage this group to look at the recommendations in the DNR legislative report and the recommendations in the Deloitte report on modifications to DNR's operations. I would argue there's some real pros that they hit really hard in Deloitte on accounting and tracking. Commissioner Johnson, of course, has been working with his other two commissioners very heavily on getting a lot of the reporting of revenue to the beneficiaries improved. It was very clear in the Deloitte report that was something that they saw DNR needed to improve on. There's some concerning things about permanent funds and what I feel what the permanent funds are for versus what DNR would like to use them for. I think we will have a difference of opinion on some of those. Some other needed changes that they do need to do, but I really encourage people to do that. There is a 2-week comment period open right now. You can get the link to their comment survey on that website and the report. It's a lengthy report. If you're a numbers geek, it's great. If you just need something to go to sleep and you hate numbers, it's a great one to read too right before bed. But that I would really dig into because that has the potential for impacting volume and economic development on the Olympic Peninsula, depending on how and where some of those proposals go. And some of those proposals, DNR will be working with stakeholders over the interim to craft legislation for next year.
So Matt, I put the link in the chat for those of us that are not interested in going through it in detail. Is there an executive summary with like the highlighted points of what the recommendations are in that link? I see there's lots of different options to click on.
So there is executive summaries in, so there's 3 reports. There's a legislative report written by DNR that has an executive summary and a summary towards the end of it of the recommendations DNR developed in Deloitte. Then there's the Deloitte report, which towards the end of it, and I think that also includes a couple of appendices, are their actual recommendations. And that's where I would look at their executive summary and then jump down to their recommendations. Like I said, if you're really into the rest of it, you can dive back into the 200 pages in between. And then there's a ecosystem services report done by Earth Economics that is characterized as non-market values. I think some of us, when we went into getting the legislation for this, we want an ecosystem services evaluated as a market. And since currently, including carbon, there is no real market for DNR trust lands on ecosystem services. They put a big $ on it, but I still go back to, unless you have 2 at arm's length, willing seller, willing buyer, and an actual market, it has no value. Your car, unless somebody wants to buy it and you want to sell it, has a value of 0 except for taxation purposes. And so unfortunately that's one thing that I would say with the ecosystem services to keep in mind. You'll see $ through there, but there's no way to monetize those values currently, and even though they're presented as a monetary value to the trust. They may be a social value, but not necessarily a monetary value. So that's what I'd recommend. Look to pull it up here, but the executive summary and then the recommendations in the Deloitte and the DNR reports where I would focus.
Okay.
Mr. McIntyre had a question about the percentage of state lands and state forest lands in Clallam County that are off base as a result of last sustainable harvest calculation. At the county level, Jim, I would have to do some digging. I will tell you that DNR uses the figure of about 40% in Western Washington. though I would say as we dig into it and look closer, I have been using the figure 50% and not getting any significant pushback from those in the know at DNR. And I have fears that it may actually be closer to 55 to 65% when you start looking at all of the various things that take land out of management production. So it's somewhere between 40 and 60. And I think Clallam County would track pretty closely to the upper range of that due to some the special habitat areas, those type of things created by the murrelet.
Yeah, Matt, that's my suspicion as well. I think that's an important number to know in terms of trust land performance.
I think as you move west, Jim, the percentage off base increases dramatically versus what's on the east. The number that sticks out in my mind is actually pretty close to 52%, somewhere in there after the latest long-term conservation strategy, I believe.
And Kai has a question. Kai, do you want to ask that?
Thank you. My question is related, just to understand this number a little bit better. What I'm trying to get at is, if you start out with what would be a sustainable cut just using prudent forestry practices without any environmental and political overlays, what lesser number is the sustainable harvest cut in the DNR calculation, and what lesser number than that is the actual amount being cut? Because of course we have the arrearages also. So let's say if 100 would be what you could responsibly cut under forest practices as they are in effect today, and 90 or 50 is the sustainable harvest cut, and how much is actually being cut on average. And I understand if you don't have countywide numbers, but just to give us an idea for Western Washington. And related to that, there's a proposal in front of the county commissioners right now for this county to hire a full-time forester to help it keep track of these issues and defend its interest. Do you have an opinion on whether that is public money well spent by a county, whether doing something like that would help?
So I'll tackle your first question first, and this isn't a cop-out, but it's hard to tell because of the unknown of the quality of the inventory of what that actual harvest volume should be. And that was one of the big reasons for pushing so hard, in 1168 to get some of that work done to update and improve the inventory and a lot of the mapping and data so that we can actually find out if 100 under forest practices is sustainable, under the HCP is 90, what are they really doing? We actually, I would argue, are not completely sure. DNR has been doing an excellent job of trying to make sure that they hit the target levels set in the last sustainable harvest calculation, which includes arrearage. I think that there's an ongoing debate with some of us about how we will be assured at the end of the current planning decade the arrearage has been fully addressed because of the way it is or is not being tracked. So I think that that's going to be a challenge going forward. In regards to the county forester, I think that in general, yes. I think in general, it could be money well spent. I think that it'll be really important for the county to have a very structured job description. And I think it'll be very important for the county to hire the right personality. If the role turns into a looking over the shoulder of what every DNR forester is doing out in the field, and kind of, for lack of a better term, babysitting, I think that role in that position will create more turmoil and more inefficiencies and struggles than it will improve. Now, if that's a role that serves to help the county dive deeper into the quarterly reports, which I will tell everyone Olympic region is the gold standard in reporting to the counties and its junior taxing districts. I keep trying to get the department to expand that out to other counties. If that's the role, I think that there's and working with the department to assist where they might need outside assistance, maybe road easements, neighbor, working with neighbors, working with adjacent large landowners. I think that that can be well spent. I'm also not convinced that there's the workload to only focus on DNR lands. And I could see the role of a county forester also engaging in the federal lands issue, working with the Department on Good Neighbor Authority, working with the Forest Service and the Olympic National Forest. And I could also see that role of supplementing the Extension Service and DNR Small Forest Landowner Office of helping, small forest landowners in the management of their lands, and making sure they're in compliance with, things like forest management plans that are required under county regulations in order to get the reduced valuation on their taxes for forest land. So I think it really depends on how you structure and define the job description. It could be really good, it could be really bad, or it could just be, something that kind of helps the general thing move forward and kind of is useful, but not necessarily, moving the ball, It could be something that incrementally moves the ball inches down the field, or it could be moving it yards down the field.
So quickly, Rod put in the chat a link to the California Cap and Trade Market summary. What do you pull from that? I look at that and see a bunch of numbers, but I don't know exactly what that means. How much money is that generating? And is that a lot relative to what they're doing if in comparison to if that were being harvested? And so can you give a bit of a summary of what that chart is saying?
I've not pulled up the chart, but I will. Oh, yeah, that's lots of numbers. So interestingly enough, I've been diving into carbon and carbon offset projects a lot lately, partly for my work at AFRC and partly for a couple of personal side projects I'm working on, including one of them of trying to get a county-owned community forest started here in Lewis County, and digging into carbon offset projects. DNR, I found out through, I attend a quarterly meeting with a group called the National Association of School Trust Lands, and Minnesota DNR is diving deep into trying to develop a large carbon offset project selling carbon credits, because they have a big chunk of trust lands that they can't monetize through traditional forestry mechanisms. What I've learned is, well, one, of course, you have to show additionality. You can't get paid for just doing what you normally would do. The HCP creates a huge barrier to showing additionality. If like the effort to move trust lands out of trust status into NRCA's natural resource conservation areas, once you've moved that into there, they're considered protected. They're no longer additional. You can't sell under the voluntary or CARB market, California Air Source Resource Board. You can't sell carbon credits for those. What I have found is the CARB, or California Air Resources Board market, the barrier to entry is huge. Depending on the size of the project, I've been told the numbers are anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000 just to get to the point of being able to sell credits. But then you don't actually get paid for those credits until 10, 15, 20 years down the line. There are some other voluntary market opportunities that are out there that DNR basically won't be able to show additionality. I think the biggest opportunity where DNR can potentially put one together right now is for reforestation of burned over trust lands in eastern Washington where they don't have the money to reforest those. There are some carbon protocols where DNR can actually get paid to reforest those, sell the carbon credits, and then at rotation age actually go out and harvest the trees. That seems to be about the best opportunity right now that I see for DNR. But under California, it is such a huge barrier to entry. I don't see DNR being able to engage in that. They still have to, under statute, provide timber into the marketplace. They still have to pay the beneficiaries. And so that lag in revenue is going to really make it difficult for them to do much, like, because they would have to lengthen out rotation ages on lands that they're available to manage, which means foregoing revenue. And from everything I've been able to find, most of those types of projects where you would lengthen out rotation ages or voluntarily take land out of production, there's a large delay in time until you actually start receiving payments.
Okay. All right. So I see it is a bit after 9 o'clock. Matt or Rod, Bruce, I see Randy Johnson is on as well. Does anybody have any last comments you want to make to wrap things up? No, Rod shaking his head no.
I would just say that if anybody has further questions or wants to reach out to me, feel free to ask Colleen for my contact information. More than happy to talk with people. And when we get back in the world of traveling, more than happy to get back on the road to Clallam County.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Matt. We really appreciate your time today and your expertise in this space and sharing some time to explain this kind of complicated process to us all. So thanks everyone. And I think we will call it a morning. We appreciate your attendance. So enjoy your week.
Are you going to stay on for a minute, Colleen?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you.